And Vic,
Raxo and the Rats of NIMH by Jane Leslie Conley. Emergency. Mrs. Frisby, a brown field mouse, hummed softly to herself as she folded her son Timothy's clothing, a sweater, a jacket, a red scarf. The latter needed mending, she noted, and set it in a separate pile from the others. It was unusual for her to be alone in the house, as she was now. Her children, Martin, Cynthia, Teresa, and Timothy, were harvesting today. There was a great deal to be done. Over the summer, Martin, her elder son, had found a mate, a lovely young mouse named Bretta. They had moved to a small nest under a rotted sycamore stump in the meadow. Now food for the winter must be gathered for his family too, and tomorrow Timothy would leave home to go to school. This would be his third year as a student in a school run by the super-intelligent Rats of NIMH. He had learned a great deal there, so much that Mrs. Frisby had lost track of the subjects he had studied. He could read and write, did math problems, and knew the earth was round, which was hard for Mrs. Frisby to believe. He knew the constellations and could predict with a good deal of accuracy how long it would take to travel to a place where one had never been before. Thinking of travel made Mrs. Frisby sigh, for the school was a long way off, miles and miles away, in a remote section of the state forest called Thorn Valley. It was so far that Timothy was not able to come home during the school session, which lasted for 9 months of the year. Mrs. Frisby missed him terribly. So I must mend the scarf, she thought, and I will pick his favorite foods in his knapsack in case he doesn't reach Thorn Valley in time for dinner tomorrow. And I must clean out the cupboard to make room for the beans that the children will be bringing. With that thought, she hurried into her kitchen, which was really one half of a cinder block mired deep in the earth near a large stone in the Fitzgibbons garden. Mrs. Frisby loved the cinder block house. It was cozy and warm in winter, and it was safe, ever since the rats had moved it out of the path of Mr. Fitzgibbon's plow. For an instant, Mrs. Frisby recalled that terrible spring 3 years ago, when Timothy had been sick with pneumonia and the cinder block house in danger of being crushed in the March plowing. The rats had worked all night, moving the house into the lee of the stone, where the dirt remained unturned throughout the year. Mrs. Frisby still felt a debt of gratitude to the rats for saving her house and her son's life. Today, the sunlight fell through the entrance hole into her kitchen in a lovely garden, in a lovely golden arc. Mrs. Frisby stood in it for a moment, feeling it warm her head and back. Then she reached for a broom and began to sweep some bits of corn husk into a pile. She had almost finished doing this when she heard, from someplace up above her head, a great to-do. "Mrs. Mouse!" rasped a loud voice. "It's Timothy's mother! Come out!" Mrs. Frisby hurried up the entrance hole, broom in hand, and poked her head out cautiously to see who was there. It was young Jeremy, a crow she had once befriended, and he was hopping up and down in agitation. "Mrs. Frisby!" he shouted. "I was so upset I forgot your name." "Goodness, Jeremy," Mrs. Frisby said. "Calm down and tell me what's wrong." "I can't take Timothy to school tomorrow," Jeremy shouted. He looked close to tears. "It's an emergency. I have to go home right away. My mother's very sick. She flew into a ladder and broke her wing." And with that, a large tear slid down the black feathers under Jeremy's eye. Now, Mrs. Frisby said, keeping her voice calm for Jeremy's benefit. "My cousin brought the news this morning," Jeremy added. "I went to Mr. Age's, and he says that she may not fly for a whole month. And he gave me some powder for her to swallow after dinner." Secretly, Mrs. Frisby was surprised that Jeremy had thought to visit Mr. Ages, the white mouse who served as doctor for the wild animals who lived on the farm. "You did well," she said. "And of course you should fly home. Your mother will need your help."
"But what about Timothy? School starts next week, and I was supposed to fly him to Thorn Valley tomorrow."
"We will manage," Mrs. Frisby said, although inside she wondered how they would manage. "You must stay with your mother while she needs you."
"Will she die?"
Jeremy asked. Another tear slid through his black feathers. "Of course not," Mrs. Frisby said. But when she saw Jeremy's stricken expression, she tried to make her tone more kindly. "Just make sure she takes Mr. Age's powder. Within a month her wing should be as good as new."
"Thank you,"
Jeremy said.
"Oh, thank you."
"You're welcome," Mrs. Frisby said dryly, and she ducked her head to avoid the flap of Jeremy's large wings as he heaved himself into the air.
"See you later,"
he shrieked from up above her, loud enough to be heard for a mile around, she thought to herself, and then he quickly flew away. Mrs. Frisby retrieved her broom and returned slowly to her kitchen. She sat down in the corner of the room and tried to think. She knew that going to school was the most important thing that had ever happened to Timothy, and that he must continue. He was not a strong mouse, and never would be physically strong, so it was all the more important that he had an education. Then when trouble did come along, for surely everyone must anticipate at least a small amount of misfortune, he would be able to reason his way out of it. Timothy knew the way to Thorn Valley. He had seen the route 4 times from up on Jeremy's back as they flew over the woods, but he had never made such a long trip on foot, and this year there was no one who could go with him. "Of course I can do it, Mother," he said, as they sat eating the ripe kidney beans the children had brought home. "I know exactly how the river winds and where the trail goes north. The trip from there will only be 1 day." "But the whole trip will take 4 days," Mrs. Frisby said. "I'd get there the day before school starts," Timothy said. "That is, if I leave tomorrow." "What about food? I'm not sure you can carry a 4-day supply." "I won't have to carry that much," Timothy said eagerly. "The autumn olives are out everywhere. We had some for lunch today. And the acorns will be at their best. I do love fresh acorns." Mrs. Frisby looked at her small son. His eyes were bright with excitement. "I know how much you want to go," she said, "but I'm not promising anything. I'll think about it while you sleep." Timothy nodded, but he was unusually quiet during the rest of the meal, and several times he smiled to himself. Mrs. Frisby could tell that he was thinking about the trip. Later in the night, as she sat alone in the kitchen, Martin came to talk to his mother.
"I think you should let Timothy go," he said. "He's starting to grow up. Today picked more beans than any of us, and school means so much to him."
"I know that," Mrs. Frisby said, "but it's a long journey with many dangers, and Timothy has never traveled alone."
"I wish I could go with him," Martin said. "But I don't want to leave Bretta for so long, and I still have more harvesting to do."
"Of course," Mrs. Frisby said. She kissed her son good night, and after he left she thought of her husband, Jonathan, who had died 4 years ago. He had been on a mission for the rats when he had died. No gains without a risk, he had often told her. Yet losing him made her want to keep the children with her for a long, long time. Mrs. Frisby sat thinking until very late. By the time she went to bed, the moon had moved from above the field to behind the trees, and the owl had returned from his nightly hunt. She fell asleep with her mind made up. The journey. The morning was crisp and clear. Mrs. Frisby was up early preparing breakfast. When the three children emerged from their bed of straw and fluff, she looked Timothy squarely in the face and said, "You may go." For the next hour, Timothy made and discarded lists of what to take in his knapsack: a jacket for winter, the scarf, a small pocket knife, a gift from the rats on his completion of last year's term, some dried beans, a portion of sweetened oats from the bin in the Fitzgibbons barn, a pocket dictionary, a pencil, a piece of string. "Why?" Mrs. Frisby asked. "To make a splint, in case I should break my leg," Timothy said. Mrs. Frisby decided not to ask any more questions. Timothy also drew a map on a scrap of paper and gave it to his mother. He showed her a wiggly line, which was meant to be the river, and another line, which lay close and then moved farther away from the trail. "Thorn Valley is here," he said, pointing to the top of the paper, "in case you need me or decide to come and visit." Mrs. Frisby was not sure that those lines would help her find a place beyond the river and across a high mountain, but she folded the paper neatly and put it in a small hole where she kept a few valued possessions. Finally, he was ready to leave. Martin, Teresa, and Cynthia agreed to walk with Timothy across the meadow to the edge of the woods, but Mrs. Frisby kissed her son goodbye at the edge of the entrance hole. "The rats will be good to you," she said. "Please send word of how you are, Timothy, and don't travel at night." She smiled. "We will miss you." And so Timothy began his journey. He waved goodbye to his sisters and brother at the border of the forest and walked northeast, keeping low to the ground as he had been taught. The fallen leaves, which rustled in the breeze, were an excellent camouflage and made Timothy's slight movements almost unnoticeable. He had tucked a beech leaf over the bulk of his knapsack so that it would not be visible. He felt extremely happy. He walked for several hours without stopping. Eventually, he came to a stream. The sun was directly overhead, and he was beginning to feel a bit tired. He sat down under a small bush and rested, and let his hind feet float in the water. He removed the beech leaf and took off his knapsack, but rather than eat any of his provisions, he found a broken walnut on the ground not far from where he had been resting. In the twisted cavities there were several nut meats that a larger animal had been unable to reach. His small paws removed them easily, and they were wonderfully sweet. Along the stream bed he saw salamanders and crayfish creeping among the rocks, and he watched them until he felt rested and ready to go on. He followed the stream as it wound slowly northward. The woods were very still. Twice he heard the hammering of a woodpecker, each time from a distance away, and he thought once he heard crows calling. He took cover then, for their cry is often a warning of hawks or owls. But the sound faded, and he continued on his way. About a half-mile above the spot where he had stopped to rest, Timothy began to notice something puzzling. Here and there along the trail, the leaves were pushed aside, as if some animal had recently and very carelessly followed the same path. Timothy knew that no wild animal would leave such a noticeable trail. Perhaps he thought it is only the wind, which blows stronger along the banks of the stream where there are no trees. Yet each time he began to think that the wind was the cause, he would come across a place that seemed a little too messy. As the sun began to slant through the trees from the west, he decided to find a place to sleep. Only a short distance up the path, he saw a small oak tree with a knothole in it. He scurried up the trunk until he was just below the hole. Cautiously, he looked inside. There was a small room, clean and dry. It was perfect. Timothy stashed the knapsack in one corner, then scouted the area and spotted a clump of wild mushrooms growing on a rotting elm stump. Dinner! He pulled up 2 mushrooms and carried them up the tree into the hollow space. He ate as much as he wanted and then spread his jacket on the rough floor. The sun had sunk below the tree line, so it was now almost completely dark. He lay down and went to sleep. He woke only once in the night. He was dreaming, and in his dream he had finished school at Thorn Valley and was now an engineer. He decided to build his family a beautiful house, a house such as no field mouse had ever lived in. He designed it out of stone, with many rooms and an open space for picnics or napping in the center of the house. He was in his bedroom reading and could hear the murmur of his sisters' voices in the open court. He sensed vaguely that there was something wrong in his design and that they were in danger. Suddenly, a scream split the air. "Hawk!" He woke up, shaking. Peeping out of the knothole, he saw that the woods were bathed in moonlight, so that each tree cast a faint shadow on the ground. In his own tree, where the lower branches were outlined among the fallen leaves, was the silhouette of a huge bird. He crept back to bed and pushed his jacket into the farthest corner of the hollow space. He curled into a tiny ball and hid his face. After a while, he went back to sleep. When he woke up, sunlight was streaming into his room. He looked out cautiously and up. The hawk was gone. He ate more mushroom and treated himself to a bit of the oats his mother had packed for him. Then he slid down the tree trunk and was on his way. It was another beautiful day. Timothy drank from the stream, humming a tune to match the rippling of the water. He skipped along the path. The leaves gave off a lovely musty smell. He trotted along happily and then stopped short. Ahead of him, in the trail, were the remains of a tiny campfire. The wood was still smoldering, and several of the burning sticks had twigs that stretched out into the fallen leaves. It was clear that the fire could spread. Timothy rushed to the spot, broke the twigs off, and threw them into the middle of the fire. He climbed down into the stream bed and carried several loads of pebbles and wet sand back up the bank and dumped them on the fire. It steamed and hissed. He folded a large leaf into a shallow cup and carried water up the bank to pour onto the smoldering heap. Finally, he was certain that the fire was completely out. Timothy was astounded. He could not imagine who would build such a fire and then forget to put it out. Yet it was clear that the fire had been built by a small animal, one that was just his size or perhaps a little bigger. He continued along the trail. Now he was cautious. He realized that he was traveling not far behind an animal that was different from any he had ever known. Perhaps it was dangerous, even fierce. He took cover every few feet and stopped to listen. He noticed that the leaves along the trail continued to be pushed aside, as if someone had plowed his way right down the middle, without the least concern for covering his trail. Once he noticed a shred of paper on the trail. He stopped and picked it up. It was brown, with writing on it. He could decipher. Hirsch, Minia, Chalk. The paper had a strong, sweet smell. The sun was high in the sky. Timothy felt quite hot and had just made the decision to sit down and rest under a bush when he heard a voice from the direction of the stream. It was crying, "Help! Help! Help!" A new friend. Timothy stopped stock still. A wave of fear swept through him as the shouts continued. Suddenly, he felt small and very young. He might be hurt or even killed trying to save this unknown animal. On the other hand, he was the only one around to help. He hurried to the stream bank and peeked over the side. A very small rat was floating in a whirlpool upstream, clinging desperately to a stick with its front paws. The water was deep and fast-flowing. Timothy could not see its face. It struggled pitifully and shouted again, "Help!" Timothy broke off a thin sapling and dragged it down the bank to the water's edge, just opposite the rat. He flung off his knapsack and, bracing himself behind a stone, extended the branch as far as it would reach, almost to the center of the stream. "Here!" he yelled. "Grab this!" The rat spun around, saw the branch, and lunged for it. It sank completely under the water, but within seconds it emerged and grasped the branch with both paws. Only its nose was above the waterline, and it was a dead weight in the stream. Timothy pulled the branch in, hand over hand, for as long as he could, then angled it downstream so that the rat would be swept into a shallow channel about half a foot from the shore. Within seconds it was there, a gray, wet heap against the rocky stream bed. The rat lay still for a long time, so long that Timothy began to think that it might have died. Then he heard it choking, a rasping series of coughs. Again it lay still, then it groaned, got up on all four legs, and shook itself. It turned around and saw Timothy.
"You," it said, "you saved me."
Timothy nodded.
"Saved by a mouse," the rat muttered. "Wait till my family hears about this."
Timothy had never seen such a small rat, but he decided to keep that observation to himself.
"My name is Timothy Frisby," he said. "I'm Raxo," said the rat. "How do you do?"
Raxo rested and dried himself on a stone in the sunshine. He did not look at Timothy or speak to him. After a while he got up and searched among the leaves until he uncovered a paper bag. He reached inside it and took out a black beret and jammed it on his head. He shot Timothy a suspicious glance and checked the contents of the bag. Satisfied, he nodded to himself and tucked the bag under his arm. Timothy could not decide whether to stay or go. He was very curious about the rat, who he was, where he had come from, why he was so small. On the other hand, Raxo did not seem inclined to talk, and he had not been particularly appreciative about the rescue. In fact, he seemed to think he was somehow superior to Timothy. Timothy knew that if he delayed too long, he would not arrive in time for the first day of school. "It was nice to meet you," he told the rat.
"Quiet," said the rat.
"Goodbye," Timothy said.
"Goodbye,"
said Raxo. Timothy put on his knapsack, but as he began to walk down the path, he heard the rat get up and begin to follow him. He looked around. Sure enough, Raxo was walking about 20 feet behind him, scattering leaves in every direction. Timothy stopped.
"Since you're going my way," he told the rat, "I'll wait and walk with you."
They walked together for some time without speaking. As Raxo's fur dried, Timothy noticed that he was really quite an attractive rat, despite his small stature. He had a jaunty, self-confident gait, and occasionally whipped his tail smartly through the air, tossing the leaves up behind him in a small cloud. Sometimes he sang a song under his breath, with lyrics and music Timothy had never heard before.
"Gonna find my baby, gonna take her home with me."
They walked for several hours. Timothy could see that Raxo was getting tired. Finally, the rat said,
"I've got to stop and rest."
Timothy pointed to a flat stone under a shade tree.
"Good,"
said Raxo, and then,
"Have you eaten?"
"Not since breakfast."
"I've got something good to eat."
He opened the paper bag and dug around inside with his paw.
"Here."
He handed Timothy something in a brown wrapper. Timothy saw that the paper was identical to the shredded paper he had found on the trail earlier.
"What is it?"
Raxo looked astounded.
"It's candy."
"What is candy?"
"What is candy? I don't think there was anyone on Earth who didn't know exactly what candy is."
"I didn't think there was anyone on Earth who would go into a stream if he couldn't swim," Timothy answered. The rat's eyes met his briefly.
"Here,"
he said, taking the object back into his paws. He tore off the paper, uncovering a brown molded thing. He broke off a piece of it and gave it to Timothy.
"Eat it."
Timothy tasted the brown stuff and was overpowered with its sweet, waxy flavor.
"It's wonderful," he said. "You may have the whole bar," said Raxo. "I brought an entire bag with me. They've been quite heavy to carry, but there aren't many left now."
Timothy felt a little self-conscious as he unwrapped his own corn husk packets. "Would you like a kidney bean?" he asked. Raxo made a face.
"Where did you get it?"
"I picked them in Mr. Fitzgibbon's field."
"Oh,"
said Raxo with a look of superior understanding.
"then you must be a field mouse."
"Correct," Timothy said shortly.
"I'm not a field rat," said Raxo. "I'm a city rat. I left my family and all my girlfriends. They cried, of course, and they pleaded, but I told them I had to go. I'm in pursuit of a better life. I have friends here in the country, rats who can read and write."
Raxo looked at Timothy to see whether he was impressed, but Timothy regarded him levelly. "What are the rats' names?" he asked carefully. Raxo looked a little embarrassed.
"Actually, I don't know their names," he said, "but I know they live somewhere in this direction."
"Have you met them before?"
"Actually, no," Raxo said, "but I'm sure they will be glad to meet me."
"How will you find them?"
"I'll keep walking in this direction. Then I'll turn and follow the trail where the river splits," Raxo said. "If what my old man says is right, it'll be about 1 day's trip from there."
"So, your father is a friend of theirs?"
"He was,"
Raxo said. Timothy thought he seemed to hesitate, as if he weren't sure whether to tell the whole story, but then he went on.
"He once shared a cage with one of them at a laboratory called NIMH. Scientists taught them how to read and gave them special shots to make them smart. They got so smart that they figured out how to escape. My dad lived with them for a while. They had a big nest with electric lights and running water and a big refrigerator. But there was a fight, and my dad and some of the other rats left."
"What happened then?"
"I don't know everything. All I know is that my old man was in an accident so bad that the rest of his friends were killed. He was burned, but he managed to save himself. After he got better, he went back to the city instead of the colony. He found my mom and moved back in with her. And after that, my sister and I were born."
An idea about who Raxo's father was had begun to grow in Timothy's mind, but before he could ask more questions, Raxo spoke again. This time it was as if he were arguing with someone who wasn't there.
"Learning is important," he said. "I've got to educate myself. I can't spend my whole life lying around in the sewers eating garbage."
"Have you been to school?" Raxo shook his head sadly.
"There are no schools for rats in the city. My dad taught me a few things, but then he got scared. He said education had almost killed him, and it had killed 6 other rats. He said those shots the humans gave him had turned him into a misfit. He said if there's one thing I need to remember, it's that I'm a rat, and nothing more."
"How did you convince him to let you come here?"
"I didn't. I ran away."
Raxo grinned, but there was a hint of nervousness in his voice.
"I'm on my own now. I'm going to get my education and become a scientist. I'm going to make discoveries and become famous. I'll be on TV and on the cover of Time magazine."
"But how did you know where to go?"
"My dad had an accident in a town called Smithville, so I asked different animals and birds which highway went toward it, and they told me. It turned out there were big green signs along the highway, but I couldn't read them. I bribed a squirrel to lead me into town. I gave him 3 candy bars."
Raxo shook his head sadly.
"And the local rats knew how to get to Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm. Then I met this dumb crow who told me how to get to Thorn Valley. I offered him candy, but all he wanted was a silver cigarette paper I'd pulled out of the trash that morning.
Timothy stiffened.
What was the crow's name? Oh, I don't know. Jimmy or Jerry or something like that. He was all shook up because his mother was sick and he wanted the silver paper for a present for her.
Raxo shook his head.
What a jerk. His name is Jeremy,
Timothy said coldly.
He may not be the smartest bird in the world, but he's kind-hearted. And he would have given you the directions for nothing. You didn't have to bribe him. My old man taught me that nobody gets something for nothing.
Your old man? Timothy was certain now that he knew who Raxo's father was. In the written history of the Rats' adventures, there was a whole chapter devoted to him. It was called Jenner's Tragedy. They sat for a moment in silence. Timothy was fascinated by the situation he found himself in. He, like the rats, had assumed that Jenner was dead. Not only was he alive, but he had a son, and his son had a lot in common with Timothy. Both their fathers had escaped from NIMH, and both sons had left home to get an education. Still, Raxo's superior attitude was irritating. Timothy decided to teach him a lesson. He deliberately kept his expression casual as he reached into his knapsack and pulled out the little dictionary. He closed his throat and he cleared his throat and turned the pages until he came to the one he was looking for.
Rat,
he read aloud.
R-A-T. Any of certain rodents, genus Rattus, and allied genera, distinguished from mice by their larger size and differences in teeth. The best known species are the brown or Norway rat, the black rat, and the roof rat.
Raxo's eyes opened wide in disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Timothy continued.
Mouse. Any of numerous species of small rodents, especially the house mouse, found in human habitations throughout the world. Compare vole.
You, Raxo squeaked.
You.
Timothy smiled.
You can read,
Raxo shouted. Timothy nodded.
Will you teach me, please?
Timothy was silent. Raxo groaned.
I'll give you anything you want, if only you will teach me, Timothy.
Timothy smiled slightly, but he shook his head. Raxo looked ready to burst into tears.
I won't teach you,
Timothy said.
But I have a friend who will. Rat friends. They have a school at Thorn Valley, and they teach almost every subject you can name. Reading, writing, carpentry, math, astronomy.
The Rats of NIMH, Raxo whispered reverently. Timothy nodded.
I'm on my way to school right now, he said, and you may come with me.
A narrow escape. It was almost an hour before Raxo let Timothy put the dictionary away so that they could resume walking.
Just one more word, he would plead, or he would ask, is this the letter B?
Finally, Timothy began to feel concerned about their time.
We've got to move on, he said. It's only a few hours until twilight, and we'll have to stop then.
They hurried down the trail. In another hour, they began to hear the sound of the river to the west, and several times Timothy thought he could see the gleam of the river through the brush. They agreed to camp where the stream and the river merged. A brisk wind tossed the leaves up in their faces, and they arrived at the juncture just as the sunlight was beginning to fade.
I'll make a campfire,
said Raxo, but Timothy pointed out a large bird's nest in the middle branches of a birch tree. It was tattered and had clearly been abandoned for several seasons. "It's perfect," he said. "The high edges will shelter us from the wind, and it's probably lined with feathers, too. Anyway, it would be dangerous to make a fire on such a windy day." They climbed the tree. Raxo, with some difficulty, since he was still clutching the paper bag, and peered over the side into the nest. It looked clean and soft. They scrambled in, and each ate a light supper. As soon as they finished eating, they both lay down and closed their eyes. But Timothy could not fall asleep. He remembered the chapter in the Rat's history book, which described Jenner as tough, smart, and cynical. He had been the rat who had argued with Nicodemus, the leader, who had maintained that the rats had every right to steal food and electricity from the farmers. He had opposed the move to Thorn Valley as naive, arguing that the rats were entitled to a life of luxury without work, that the smartest animals always managed to take advantage of those who were less smart, in this case, Farmer Fitzgibbon. And when the rest of the community had sided with Nicodemus, Jenner and his followers had left. It was Timothy's mother who had first learned about the rat's death. She had overheard Mr. Fitzgibbon and his family discussing a newspaper article about some rats who had been electrocuted while they were trying to move a motor from the shelf of a hardware store. Scientists had come to town to investigate. Had the rats been trying to move the motor, they wondered? And if so, why? Could these rats be part of the intelligent group that had escaped from NIMH almost 3 years before? Were there others in the area? So, the accident had ended up endangering all the rats. Trying to collect specimens, the scientists had destroyed the nest under the rosebush, and 2 rats had died in that encounter. But since the move to Thorn Valley, the rats had been safe and happy. They had multiplied, grown their own crops, built their own shelter. Young rats went to school 3 seasons of the year. Timothy stirred in his bed. How would Raxo fit into that community? Would he become like the other rats, cheerful and enthusiastic? Or would he be more like his father? These questions turned in Timothy's mind until finally sleep came, easing them away. He awoke to bright sunlight and the sound of the river. He felt rested, and the sight of Raxo sleeping on his back with paws curled up in the air made him laugh. The view from the nest was lovely, the forest floor carpeted with orange and yellow leaves, then the river, wide and shining in the sun. The water was high this season, higher than Timothy could ever recall. Had there been that much rain over the summer? Just as Timothy was trying to remember, Raxo stirred, groaned, and sat up.
"What's for breakfast?" he asked.
"I've got beans and oats," Timothy said, "but I'd be willing to bet there'll be autumn olives down by the river. They're berries. Have you ever tasted them?"
"I think my mother brought some home from the market once, but I'm not sure."
"Come on," said Timothy. But then, remembering Raxo's city upbringing, he added, "You always poke under the bushes first with a stick to make sure there aren't any snakes hiding there. Snakes can be very nasty."
"I'll remember that,"
Raxo said, and Timothy noticed that he did use a long branch to stir up the leaves under each clump of berry bushes. When they finished eating, Raxo picked extra berries and put them in his paper bag.
"For lunch," he said. "They'll be perfect with the candy bars."
And they set off down the path beside the river. At first they made good progress. The day was bright, but as the sun rose higher in the sky it became quite hot. Raxo began to pant.
"I'm thirsty,"
he complained. Another time he whined,
"I'm too hot."
Timothy realized that they would have to slow their pace. He had intended to reach the point where the river branched by evening, but that no longer seemed likely. When the sun had passed a midpoint in the sky, they stopped for lunch. Raxo ate 3 candy bars and all the berries he had picked, offering some to Timothy. He drank a great quantity of water from a small pool beside the river. Timothy ate only a few beans and a bit of fresh acorn. They began to walk again. Raxo had walked more and more slowly. He was panting hard. Timothy tried walking a little ahead of him at a steady pace, but the rat fell farther and farther behind. Finally, he stopped.
I'm sorry, he said, but I have to take a nap.
Perhaps we could just sit down and rest for a minute, Timothy said.
Sure,
Said the rat. But no sooner had they sat down beside the path than Raxo tumbled over onto the dry leaves and fell asleep. He slept for 2 hours. When he awoke, it was mid-afternoon. Timothy felt quite depressed. He didn't want to push the rat too hard. On the other hand, he certainly didn't want to miss the first day of school. Raxo seemed to understand the problem, even though he was unaware of Timothy's deadline.
I'm afraid I'm used to sleeping during the day, he said. In the city, we rats are most active at night, when the humans are asleep. I guess that's why being out in the sunlight makes me so tired.
Country animals don't go out after dark if they can help it, Timothy said. Owls hunt at night.
I have only heard of owls,
Raxo said. They walked on, keeping a steady pace, but it was not long before the sun disappeared behind the tall trees and the light began to fade. We'll have to find a place to sleep, Timothy said. They searched among the trees and shrubs until they found shelter in a hollow log. It was damp but clean. They ate moderately from their store of provisions and stretched out to go to sleep. When Timothy awoke, it was still night time. Raxo was standing at the opening of the log, looking out. He seemed glad to see Timothy awake.
I couldn't sleep, he said. It's so beautiful out. There's a full moon. Come and look.
What time is it?
I'm not sure.
Timothy went to the entrance of the log. The moon was high in the sky and cast a lovely light on the river and woods. The path was illuminated, almost as if it were day.
I've never seen anything so beautiful, Raxo exclaimed. In the city, on nights like this, we all come out and play. You see rats everywhere, dancing, running, jumping. They call it moon fever.
I've never been outside the house at night, said Timothy. Yet, looking at the moon, he felt restless, as if he wanted to be out.
I don't think I can go back to sleep, Raxo said.
I feel wide awake myself, Timothy said.
I know that you're worried we didn't travel far enough today, Raxo said. I wouldn't mind walking a mile or two right now.
Timothy started to say no, for his mother had taught him that it was dangerous for a small animal to travel at night. On the other hand, they were way behind schedule, and it was clear that Raxo would make better time at night when it was cooler, and the moon was so bright that they should be able to spot any sign of danger, just as they would during the daytime. He struggled to decide. If they could walk 2 miles, they would probably reach the place where the river split. From there, it was only 1 day's travel to Thorn Valley. All right, he said, but we'll have to be careful, really careful. They gathered their supplies, and Timothy put on his knapsack. They climbed out of the log and across the leaves onto the path and began to walk. There was something magical about traveling through the semi-darkness, with the moon shining overhead. Timothy felt as if he were entering a new world. They hurried down the trail, passing from moonlight to darkness, where overhanging trees shadowed the path. Raxo sang happily in a low voice. It was the same song Timothy remembered him singing when they had first met. Gonna find my baby. There were no signs of life anywhere. After a bit, Raxo stopped singing. Then Timothy noticed that it was extremely still. Besides the river and the padding of their own feet, he could hear nothing at all. Raxo was walking ahead of him on his left, in the shadow of the branches of an oak tree. Suddenly, Timothy thought he saw the shadow move. Then
It did move. It stretched as if it had come alive. Timothy stopped, and as he stopped, the shadow moved to cover him and the spot where he stood. The moon was blotted out by huge, dark wings. The shape fell toward Raxo. A high-pitched scream filled the air. Raxo could not move. He was paralyzed by fear. Timothy felt the scream come up his own throat. He lunged and knocked Raxo down. He fell over on his back on top of the rats. The bird hovered above them. His yellow eyes shone like moons. Timothy saw the great talons descending, and he felt pain. Before he fainted, he pushed one last breath of air from his chest, and he shouted his name, "Timothy Frisby!" The owl hung in the air for another second. It shook the mouse from its foot with an angry cry. It rose in the dark, circled once, and flew away.